All right, so the general topic is water, and I'm going to try to make it a little bit local to here in literally Silver Reef and Leeds and Harrisburg at the beginning. But generally, and I'm going to play this video audio, and hopefully you'll be able to hear it. I think if I have my computer turned up all the way.
Oh, once I lived in Cottonwood and owned a little farm. When they called me down to Dixie, it caused me much alarm. To hoe the cane and cotton, I right away must go. But the reason why they sent me, I'm sure I do not know. I hooked up Jim and Bolly, all four to make a start. But to leave my house and garden, it almost broke my heart. We moved along quite slowly, oft times I looked behind, for the rocks and hills of Dixie kept rolling through my mind. First we reached the Black Ridge where I broke my wagon down. I couldn't find a carpenter, I was 20 miles from town. So I cut a clumsy cedar and made an awkward slide. But the wagon pulled so heavily, poor Betsy could not ride. While Betsy was a-walkin', I told her to take care, when all upon a sudden she struck a prickly pear. Then she began to blubber and she began to bawl, crying if I was back in Cottonwood, I wouldn't have come at all. Next we reached Washington, where we stayed a little while, to see if April showers could make the verdure smile. But at last I was mistaken, and so I went away, for the red hills of November looked just the same in May. I am so weak and hungry now, there's nothing here to cheer, except prophetic sermons, which I very often hear. They hand 'em out by the dozen, and they prove 'em by the book. But me, I'd like some roastin' ears to stay at home and cook. Oh, I am so weak and hungry now, I think I'm nearly dead. 'Tis 7 weeks next Sunday since I've tasted bread. Of carrot tops and lucerne greens I've had enough to eat. Boys, I'd like to change my diet to buckwheat cakes and meat. I brought this old coat with me about 2 years ago, and how I'll get another one I'm sure I do not know. May Providence protect me against the wind and wet. These times for me and Betsy I think I'll ne'er forget. This shirt was dyed with wild dock root with greasewood for a set, and I'm sure the colors they will fade when once it does get wet. They said we could grow madder here and indigo so blue, but that proved out a humbug, the story was not true. My wagon went for sorghum seed to make a little bread, and poor old Jim and Bolly long ago are dead. There's just me and Betsy left to hoe the cotton tree. May heaven protect the Dixieite, wherever he may be.
So that's kind of a story of just the people who got called down here to the Cotton Mission. And it's kind of sad because they came from a good place to a pretty difficult place to live. And the main difficulty down here was just getting good water to your crops and to your house. And so I'm going to talk about that a little bit, but then I'm going to play one more, if this works. And this I have to do a little bit of computerizing here. Come on. Okay, so I see if I can get my phone to be recognized. And this should play. Come on. Okay. So this is a song that was originally recorded in 1936 by the Sons of the Pioneers. Not Utah, but they're just Sons of Pioneers. And this is a 1960 version. It's not great video, but we'll just see if this will play. Okay. It's a nice song, and it's kind of romantic in its about the approach to water. You can hear in the song kind of water echoing and moving. It's quite melodic, and it really emphasizes cool, clear water. That's not what they had down here. Their water that came when they first settled here, it lasted until I think really about 1912 in St. George proper, and probably longer in other towns. Water came to your house by a ditch in the front yard, and in St. George, the water mostly came from springs. That's why St. George got settled. There was the West Spring up by the Dixie Red Hills Golf Course. There was one called the East Spring, kind of where the new water district building is. And those fed, they just fed down ditches, surface ditches, to all the places in town that they had water for. The rules were, I don't know that they did this right at settlement in 1861 and 62, 63, didn't figure it out that fast. But by 1878, I found records where the city council is saying, look, go out and dip your water out of the ditch between 5 and 6 or 6 and 7, depending on the time of the year. And then, because then we'll make a regulation that all the cows and all the horses are in their pens, and they can't walk through the water and make it dirty. And so you'll be drinking cleaner water and you won't get as sick. Now, that happened in part. There was a woman doctor who came down here for a year in 1876, she and her husband, and she had been in England and knew about the germ theory, where you could see the little germs in water. And that was new knowledge in the Western United States, and she transmitted it to the city council. And so after at least that time, we had some less infant mortality. But up before then, 1 in 2 kids pretty much perished just from the water they drank when they stopped being weaned by mother's milk. So water was a hard thing to come by, and it was often muddy. When they dipped it out of the ditch, they typically put it in a barrel, a great big barrel, and they had a couple of barrels, and so they'd put it in one barrel one day, and they'd wait 24 hours or 48 hours, however long, and then when that water settled, the silt all settled out of it, then they could use that water for household purposes, cooking and cleaning and drinking. So it was really pretty bad water. The other thing was, if you've lived here very long, the geography affects the quality of the water here. If you lived in Leeds, you got nice clear water out of a spring kind of to the east of town. It was great water, or Harrisburg, or of course Silver Reef. If you lived in St. George, especially Washington Field side of St. George, where the new housing places are now, that water came from the Virgin, and it's below Patempe Hot Springs, so it smells and tastes. When the Dominguez and Escalante came down here in 1776, they didn't name the river El Rio Virgen, or Virgin. They didn't name it that. They named the river El Rio Sulfureo de los Piramides. Sulfureo means smells like sulfur, okay? That's what the name of the Virgin River was. And then the Piramides, that was the pyramids that they could see. If you look across the mesas from here, you see the tops of the Zion things sticking up like pyramids above mesas. And that was the name of the river. So for a long time, so we know that below Patempe, the water smells and stinks. And so the settlements that settled originally, Santa Clara was on the Santa Clara. It didn't have Patempe water on it. It was fine. St. George got water from the 2 springs we talked about. Washington City had some springs, but in terms of irrigating larger land, they had to get their water from the Virgin, and it was a problem. I'm going to talk a little bit about this verse in this Cool Water song. Mormons generally think that this is what happened. I mean, Mormons today, that we just simply we pray, tonight we pray for water, cool water, and way up there, he'll hear our prayer and show us where there's water. I think that was how easy it was. Well, not quite. Even though we knew where the water was, we had to move it And there's a lot of what I'm going to tell you is how we move water from one place to another, how we captured it. And when the people first came down here, we talk about dams. They didn't really try to dam the river, like hold it back and impound a reservoir behind it. That was, we had enough intuitive understanding to know with the variability of the flow in the Virgin River, which they observed in the first year. Remember, they settled, the big settlement, the Cotton Mission, was 1861, and in the first 40 days after they were, in December, it kept raining until they had huge floods and washed out the fort in Santa Clara and, just damaged a lot of things. Even up in Fort Harmony, above the rim, where they had damage. And so they were aware that the rainfall and the climate was variable, so they didn't try to stop the river. All they tried to do was make little brush dams reinforced with rock and divert the water that's coming down the stream, divert it over to one side into a head gate that'll fill a canal and the ditch network, and then move it to the town. Those little kinds of brush dams would seasonally, for most of the small communities, wash out with storms 2-3 times a year and had to be rebuilt. And if they were smart, they separated the ditch network, so the ditches were sort of, when the big flood came, the ditches were removed from that. And I'm going to talk about a guy, okay? So I'm going to start talking about the challenges they had a little later than the first settlement. I think I've told this story, if people do know it. The building, the Silver Reef building that's just over next door, was owned by Woolley London Judd, which was a mercantile firm, and Wells Fargo, which is the name we call the building, Wells Fargo was their tenant. And Woolley London Judd were 3 Mormon guys. When they formed the firm, and I have to go back with a little history here on it, they made that firm between the 3 people in 1875. They all grew up down here, and they were employed in different ways. They were young. They were probably 20, 25, maybe 28 at the time they formed Woolley London Judd in 1875. Lund had been the telegraph operator since he was 16 in St. George. He was actually called personally by Brigham Young to go up and learn how to use the telegraph in Salt Lake and come back. When they first did the telegraph down there, 1867, he was the telegraph operator. Well, the interesting thing about that is, if you think about all of the telegraphs that got sent to and from St. George, most of them were sent by one person for years. The vast majority was sent by Brigham Young. The vast majority of the telegraphs that came back to St. George were to Brigham Young. And Robert Lund consequently got to know what was in Brigham Young's brain, and especially that year when they were trying to build the temple and settle this place. And Brigham Young was recruiting resources from all over the area, telegraph a place and say, we need 6 head of cattle, bring them here because we're hungry. We need bushels of wheat. We need people to build the buildings this winter, so you're called in, the middle of Utah, Spring City. You send us 6 men. That's the kind of telegraphing that was going on. And so in especially I want to say not so much a spiritual sense, but in a temporal sense, Robert Lund got to understand how the place worked, okay, by his telegraphing. The other people were Woolley. They had started a ZCMI, a Zion's Cooperative Store Movement, in 1868, and Woolley was the clerk for the whole stake. Now, a stake doesn't sound like much nowadays, but back then, all of eastern Nevada, what was Arizona, okay, and southern Nevada down as far as the Moapa Valley, that was all part of the stake, all the way over to Kanab, and part of Kane County at that time was in the stake because Leeds was in Washington County, but Tokerville was the county seat of Kane County. And that remained that way until 1882. So, and then Judd, he was a young guy, probably the youngest of the three, and he was the tithing clerk for the Mormon stake. So one guy's basically the store clerk, the other guy's the tithing clerk. And I don't know if you know how Mormons conducted business, but typically in those early years, nobody had cash. They had goods. That they could pay in tithing, and they were supposed to pay 10% of their increase. That was the law of tithing. So if you had if you had 10 chickens, you increased your little flock of chickens by 10, one went to the tithing clerk, and literally they just took the live chicken, and then there was a tithing yard. And so you always had to have a tithing house with a tithing yard, and the non-Mormons made fun of the tithing yard because it was a kind of menagerie of a whole lot of different things that would come and go, wheat, and of course stores like that were non-perishable, but you'd have grapes and you'd have things that would rot right away if they didn't get used, and people would just bring, and some of the Mormons, especially, I'll talk about grapes for a second, if they could make good wine and they could put them in bottles, they could probably wait and sell that product at a later time for some cash, maybe to a mining town. But if they had grapes and they got too many of them and they might spoil their 10% of their grapes, they could just take those almost rotted grapes over to the tithing yard and get credit. They get scrip. So scrip was just a piece of paper, and it's like an IOU. It said, it's worth so much. And they could use that at the Zion's cooperative stores. Okay, most towns had one. Site George has a good one. The biggest one was in Salt Lake. So if they wanted shoes, it was hard to get shoes. They'd have to travel up to Salt Lake, but they could use the tithing script to turn the money in. That's a big departure, but they tried to, in 1874, Brigham Young came down, this before the temples opened and the other apostles, and they preached a thing called the United Order. And the United Order, we were just supposed to have things in common and trust everybody, and money wasn't supposed to matter. You're just supposed to, not be jealous of your own possessions was the idea. Every little burg, Rockville, Leeds, everybody signed up, and they all said, they came down, they'd raise their hand and say, we'll do the United Order. That lasted for about 1 year. And then the bishops went back to the stake president, we're just not quite ready for that. It's just a little tough. We have some jealousies that are petty and otherwise, and we're just not doing real well. Can we just go back to how it was? Well, when they did that, Woolley, Lund, and Judd, the telegraph operator, Lund, and Judd and Woolley, the clerks, decided that they would start a United Order mercantile business. And they would pattern that business to some extent on what they had seen Brigham Young and the leaders of the church try to do. So first of all, they'd have their goods in common, but they'd try through this mercantile business, they would try and make the temporal progress of the stake in the area do what they thought the United Order wanted to have done. And why that matters is, I'm going to get to the Cottonwood water. Now, this is just a letterhead from their store, Woolley, Lund, and Judd, for you. And this is a big map, and I hope this is of the, okay, so this map was made in 1902.
You make it bigger.
A little bigger, but not much. I'm kind of limited by how I'm doing this. You can see Washington County, you can see Nevada, and Lincoln County in Nevada. You can see really a boundary with Kane County. This is a 1900 map, and we've now taken that, we'll call it western part of Kane County back in 1882, and we made Washington County almost the size it is now. The red and green areas are irrigated, and I hope I have a detail of this, if I can. Click, 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 okay. Nope, that's not that one. Let me see if it's the next one. Probably not. All right, so we'll just go to here. This map's good enough, okay? You have to understand that our progress was by and large measured by how much of the land we could irrigate. If you could irrigate the land, and I should go back one, I guess, really, even though it's too big to really see. There's red and green areas which you can see, but there's also, if you got close, there's little lines indicating canals and stuff. And you'll see on here places like the Hurricane Canal, the Lavercan Canal, the St. George Fields Canal, St. George and Washington Fields Canal. And then you'll see the area they irrigate. There's a big missing area if you know where Santa Clara is and Ivans. They didn't have water there yet. And of course, even Enterprise comes later than that. But we irrigated quite a bit of land, and we measured our progress. Mormons measured water. Literally how we measured it, how we claimed it, how we got a water right, is we have 1 acre of land, and we brought water to it, and we think that's enough to water it for a year, so we own 1 acre foot of water. That's kind of the measurement. Now miners, Silver Reef, they didn't measure like that. They measured miners' inches. Miners' inches of water were water flowing past a place 1 inch deep, you know, and probably maybe even 1 cubic inch of water flowing over that at a certain rate of time. So one of the problems we had early on was exchanging water rights between miners and non-miners. This is probably this is an 1885 map. And 1885, I'm going to use that for my start year, even though it's quite a bit after settlement, because a lot of things start happening in 1885. Who knows how Silver Reef was doing in 1885? It had already gotten to its peak, and by 1884, it was probably on the way out. They had a lot of mining strikes, they had some problems, and the company, Woolley London Judd, actually was the only mining company mining probably in 1885 in Silver Reef. They leased the Christie and the Stormont mills, and then they hired, the term in mining is chloriders. Does anybody know what a chlorider is? It's kind of a scavenger miner, okay? And most chloriders in other camps, they go to the waste dump and they find the old waste dump samples, and then they remine it, take it to the mill because it's got some small amount, and then that's how they make their living. Here it was pretty much, not 100%, but mostly Mormon farmers in the winter when they couldn't farm. They'd come up here, they'd look for something shiny and silver, kind of scavenging, take it to the mill, and when they got enough of a stack there, they'd have a mill run and they'd produce bullion, silver bullion, and then ship it out, and then everybody got their share. Woolley London Judd often operated all of their businesses in this time. They had that mercantile business, but the people who worked for them, that you call partners, sometimes employees, but more often than not, shareholders and partners, they're workmen, and they're going to get paid in thirds probably. They can have a third that might be actual scrip, not money, it's paper money, but it's probably not US currency. It's just script that says you have this much and it's redeemable probably at the other ZCMI stores and any place else in the area, just like tithing script was. You'll also have a share of the profits. If we make a profit, you get, say, a third of your wages would be in that share of profits. And then you'd have goods that you could get from a Woolley London Judd store, so merchandise, okay, in a third. And so that gave them an advantage in their thing, but it allowed them to do the business that they thought should be done to make the community go. And they almost always, Robert Lund especially, was the guy people would come to if they didn't have work that they could do productively on their own farm or land. They just come and, can you hire me for some purpose? And he almost always hired people, good times and bad, and became kind of like a public employment agency to some extent. Well, in 1884, I think, he's the mayor of St. George, okay? And Silver Reef has gone down, and he knows some things. He knows that all those water rights that the Mormons sold to the miners when they came to town, the miners had to have the water rights to mine. They needed water for a lot of purposes. This town needed water. And so it had to be acquired from most mining camps. The Indians were there first maybe, but they don't count, and they just took the water. Okay, this one was unique in that there was already a county system for keeping track of water. So Lund, having been the telegraph operator here intimately understanding how Silver Reef worked, knew that those rights were purchasable, reclaimable. And in many cases, they just refiled on them. They didn't pay anybody. The person they should have paid was gone. Just went like the wind to the next mining camp. So Robert Lund did a lot of that. There's a story that we talked about, and I've got a little blue circle on this map that says where the Cottonwood Spring pretty much is, and then you can see St. George, down the big black dots, the many black dots as we got.
Move your cursor there on the
Oh, I
map.
can? Oh, yeah, all right. There's St. George, and there's the spring in Cottonwood. And you'll notice, here's Silver Reef, and here's Leeds, and here's Harrisburg. And you'll notice there's a little stream that went from those things down to Harrisburg. And Harrisburg, actually, when they first settled it, they didn't think it had much water. But before the mining boom, say 1868, 1870, Harrisburg figured out there was some good springs, this Cottonwood Spring, and they started getting their water from Cottonwood Spring. But when the mining boom happened, most of the water rights were acquired from Harrisburg. Was the first community here before Leeds and certainly before Silver Reef, and then the Silver Reef miners bought the Harrisburg water rights for money from the Mormon farmers. When this 1885 comes, those water rights are available for repossession. There's a story about Robert Lund when they planned actually the people in St. George to get water from Cottonwood as early as 1878. They had the city council all vote. Let's do a project, let's survey it, let's get it going. 1878, because that was after the temple was done in 1877, after Brigham Young died. And they made a big plat. I don't know if you ever, Jesse certainly has been to St. George. You've seen how big the platted area of St. George. In 1877, there's a map hanging on the wall in downtown City Hall. And it's, how big is it? 7 feet square? 5 feet?
6 feet wide
Yeah.
and tall,
Yeah.
not including the frame, which is...
Yeah, it's a big map. It's original. The surveyor drew it in 1877. It's hanging on the wall. It's deteriorating terribly. We should archive it, but it has blocks in St. George that they platted in 1877. Past River Road to the east and south as far as town goes now, and then right up to the Black Ridge on the other side. They just filled the valley with these platted blocks. But they had no water. They had water enough for maybe 25 blocks at the time. And the rest of the blocks, with the lots on them, they were called dry lots. And so they wanted to get water to the dry lots, and they had to bring it from somewhere. And in 1878, they said, we'll get it from Cottonwood Spring. But in 1878, who owns the water to Cottonwood Springs? The miners in Silver Reef. So when it went down, Robert Lund becomes the mayor of St. George, and he says, well, I know a guy who has a ranch. I can get this water right at the spring. You know, we'll just talk to him. He's a Mormon. We'll talk to him, and he'll probably sell us that water right. And actually, the guy gave the water right to the town of St. George, as long as it was used for the people. He had a ranch. He said, I paid $200 for the ranch. You know, I don't need the money. I want the town to prosper. You know, so nice story about that. But anyway, so that's where they want to move, is that they want to move that water from there to the next place. There's a couple other things that I'm going to just fill in. Of course, they got called on a cotton mission, and they were using water at the Cottonwood Mill in as early as 1868, but for sure by 1870. And that water also came, there was some small ditch that came up towards Cottonwood, maybe not all the way to Cottonwood Springs, but up in that direction, that took water down, that ran the flume that turned the water wheel in the mill. It was actually water powered. And that's a precursor. And then, I don't know, this is just the inscription that's up on the cliffs down in Bloomington that says, that's a picture of a cotton plant if you don't know. And this is the guy named Jacob Pert that says, I was sent here to raise cotton in 1858. So these are just interesting little things. Here's Rockville, and then I just put this one in. You can see the ditches that are still there. This was a few years ago, but these ditches are still there. That's what the ditches look like. They aren't lined all with rock. Some of them are just mud. Some of them are lined with rock. And this little thing right here is called a headgate. When you lift that thing up, the water goes through this direction, maybe under your sidewalk, under a pipe or whatever, back out into your yard and irrigates your field. Okay? That's how it worked here. Probably in Rockville, it was working like that still most of the town in 2000. By 2010, about half the town will still work like that. Even though they have pipes to the town, once the water gets there, they still put it in the ditch in a portion of things. So they piped it from...
That was just to water their yards. They didn't have to...
No, that is what it was their yard, but their yard. So you have to understand a Mormon lot. That's to water their lot, and they didn't just, their lot wasn't just their front yard grass. That was their crops, their vegetables, their orchard trees, and some of those were cash crops, but most of them were just the domestic, what they needed to live on during the year. And that's how St. George worked, and that's how it, you can still see remnants in St. George. And this is just the drinking hour, a little thing. I like most these two ladies. They're actually, that picture was taken in Mesquite. They are school teachers. And what they're doing is spoofing, because they would go on and on to their kids about do not drink out of the ditch. And this posture, the push-up posture and just leaning your head over the ditch, that's how kids, even adults, drank out of the ditch. And sometimes if the ditch water was nice and clear, that was probably not a bad option, but the teachers would say, that's a bad thing. Go home to your mom and get water the way she tells you. Don't drink out of the ditch. But if they were thirsty, they'd do that. And literally in St. George, we didn't have pipe drinking waters to houses, until 1912. And in the 30s, the pictures I have, so there's a porch on everybody's house. And when you got piped water, they'd run the pipe out of the city street pipe up into your house. There'd be a little one tap, probably on the porch outside, and you'd put your bucket or whatever in there, and that's how you got your water. That was a very big innovation in the 30s, that you could have, running water. It wasn't in the house, it was on the porch. You still had to get the bucket to move it in the house, but it was a huge innovation because that water was no silt, no smell, and clean. And it was a big deal. All right, so here's my map about Kane County, and there's Tokerville, okay? And here is Silver Reef. And you can see the boundary was right there. And this was a different county. And why they changed, again, 1885 is the year I want to sort of focus on, with Robert Lund being mayor in St. George and acquiring this water, and they got the water rights for them. But they started a project that year, but it was only in 1882 they were afraid that we'd lose the Mormon vote because Silver Reef had so many people. Population was well over 1,000, and they were mostly male, and they could vote, okay? And none of them had problems with, in the 80s, the 1880s, Mormons, there was a law that if you were a polygamous Mormon, you couldn't vote. So, that was reducing the Mormon male vote and then increasing. So what the authorities did here, probably the state president from St. George or Washington County, they just said, we want all of our settlements that we helped settle in, western Kane County back. They moved the boundary to where it is pretty much today. And they recaptured Tokerville and Rockville and Springdale, all these nice, good Mormon people who could vote. Surprisingly, that we had less polygamists in maybe that direction than we had in St. George proper. At least we had less polygamists hiding out at the time. So in 1885, we've got political control. I guess that's my point here. And here's just another picture of a ditch. But we also have an event, and I don't know if I can find John Wesley Powell. Here's just pictures of pioneer-built dams. And you'll notice, here's 1909 brush dams. Here's a 1953 just pioneer brush dam. Okay, you see the brush and the horses? That's all the dam was. All it had to do was usher the water over to the head gate at the side of the thing. And we continued to do that, and we think we're all immune from that, but it wasn't really that long ago. there was some science that happened too, so that helped our water situation. In 1879, I hope I did this right. Actually, 1873 and 69, 73 were the expeditions of the John Wesley Powell expedition, who's a federal, basically paid by the federal government, the Smithsonian Institution, to find out what's here. And then quickly after that, after 1873, he becomes the head of the USGS, so the United States Geological or Geographical Survey. It might have been called Geographical early, but he's going to map out the whole area here and decide where you can collect water. You know, because he sees what the Mormons are doing. He says, well, we pretty much have to do that here. We have to do that in Utah. So John Wesley Powell decides, I'm going to do the topographic surveys, and then people are going to know where they can and where they can't build dams. Will be much more efficient. So there's a partnership forged between we'll call it what the Mormons have been doing and what the federal government wants to do. And it emerges over time in the 1890s mostly. Here's a project that I don't think Robert Lund, as the mayor, was the originator of this project, but he was mayor when it started. They'd been having the dams wash out regularly along the Virgin, and they couldn't irrigate the virgin fields. And people in Washington, in particular, were suffering, and that sometimes they had to just, you know, almost beg from the other communities for their sustenance and for provender, meaning food for their animals and their horses. They couldn't work without food for their animals. And a little bit in that song that we heard early on about the horse dying, when your horse died, you know, as your workhorse, you were in big trouble. You were almost penniless when you lost your draft, you know, your animal that was pulling your plow. And you took a lot longer to go between villages and a lot more work. So that was a bad thing to lose. Anyway, there's some sketches here, and you notice it does say 1885 in this little notice, the Millennial Star, which is an LDS publication. This, I've got some quotes from 1885 and 1886 in there, but they decided they'd build a dam by ramming posts deep in the river in the virgin sand, and that would be the way they'd have a nice sturdy dam that they'd never had before and that wouldn't get washed out when the Virgin flooded. And they got it completed, I think in 1887, late 1886, early 1887 is when they finally got it completed. And by 1889, a big flooding come down and washed the whole thing out. So now, how Robert Lund plays in this, Woolley, Lund, and Judd had some freight contracts, not just with Wells Fargo, but separate from them, to improve roads and improve, in particular, railroad grades to the north. They were trying to extend the railroad, they thought at the time, to come to St. George. They were pretty far away, but Woolley, Lund, and Judd had the contracts to build that. And in doing that, they had connections with people who owned like the things they needed for this to drive the piles in the river, a steam engine that would bang the piles down in the river. So when in 1885 there was some railroad contracts suspended in one winter, they got the crew and the machine, and they contributed that to this project. And it might have been the deciding factor to go ahead with it when the city council voted on it. So Robert Lund was instrumental. Now the other thing is, there was a big industry down here when the mines were here for timber. They would have 8-inch by 8-inch timbers, you know, as tall as they could, and they'd reinforce the mine shafts with that, including in Silver Reef. When they stopped mining actively, they stopped buying the timbers. Now the other thing that bought timbers or used timbers was the temple, but it was done in 1877, okay, or the tabernacle, and it was done before then. So the big projects that they had been using the timber for were gone. Robert Lund knew enough to know that the timber companies, whether it's as close as Pine Mountain or farther away in Kanab or way down on the strip at Mount Trumbull, he knew that people wanted, at least in these first early years, they wanted to sell some of their timber. so they could sell some of it for post, the raw timber. And so it's a combination, and you want to think of a mercantilist, that Robert Lund guy, is orchestrating behind the scenes, at least the pile dam. Now, it failed, but there was a success after it. Let me see if I can get the, okay, here's John Wesley Powell surveying, and he's active. I mean, St. George got platted officially in 1875, and we could actually, even though the town was settled in 1861, you couldn't actually own your land until it was platted by a federal surveyor and conveyed by the land office, which didn't happen here until 1875. So nobody actually owned their place. They just sort of were squatting on it before then. Here's Washington Fields Dam. All right. So they've had a lot of failures on dams, especially along the Virgin, and they want to have a success. And this is right after the failure in 1889. And a guy named Jarvis, Brigham Jarvis, I think, finds this site. He says, you know, the problem with the pile dam was when the big flood came, it actually cut the sand out under the piles, and that's why they went. So we need to build on rock. We need to have a rock foundation. And of course, these are guys that, I don't know if how many of you are Mormon, but you go to church and you sing on Sunday, "How Firm a Foundation." There's a song that's a Mormon hymn. And you'd sing it every few weeks, probably, something like that. So when they said that, that was obviously and clear to them that that was their problem. They were not building on a firm foundation. They needed rock. This is an aerial photograph here of this rock outcropping that's a ridge. You can see the little black and white shape of it right there, that little peak that you can see in the shadow right here. Okay, so they found this spot, and the Virgin River crosses this rock dike, geologic shape, and so they figure if we build there, we'll be all right. And this is down here in the lower left-hand corner. This is from 1903, Elwood Mead. Elwood Mead is the guy they named Lake Mead after. And John Wesley Powell was one of the federal, we'll call it engineering types. Elwood Mead was another. He did a whole survey of water in Utah, and especially southern Utah, that he published a big federal publication. That colored map with the areas, the red and green areas, that's Elwood Mead's map from that thing. And he's kind of got it down, and he thinks this is a big success. This is the drawing that he does for that publication, or has done, of how they built this. And you'll see, so it looks like rock over here. And of course, this white means it's a lot longer than that, this rock thing. And the rock conveys this edge of the river right here, that's water in that picture, over to this cliff, which is that cliff, okay? And then there's a tunnel they drill through that cliff, about 10 feet in diameter. So the water gets shushed out of the stream by this rock dike, okay, maybe 500-600 feet to one side. Then they take it through the hole in this rock. They figure, well, that way it's rock. If it gets too full, it won't be able to go through the hole, and that'll limit how much can go downstream to as much as we cut the hole to rock. That was their idea of not ruining their canal. And it worked. It worked, and it has worked ever since, to be honest. The other side of the thing, and that would be indicated over here, they just took the other side of the dam, and it's to the left in the lower picture, and you can see it even in the upper picture. It's called a spillway. And a spillway, Brigham Jarvis, it was a major innovation. They knew it would flood, so they said, we'll let it. We'll give them half of what we build. We'll build in brush and things, and we'll just let that get wiped out, and that'll leave half the river channel for the water to go down and spill over. Now, here it's over rock, so you see the little rapids form. And it happened within a couple years of them finishing the thing, and the dam survived. First dam that survived. First dam in the western United States that actually, you know, all of Arizona, California, that worked in a major on-stream dam. So even though it's not a they don't retain water behind and keep it in reservoir, it was a big deal. And Elwood Mead made a big deal about it in his 1903 publication, because it was only about, I think they finished it in 1893. It's only less than a decade old. And it had irrigated, I think, 3,000 or 4,000 acres in Washington Field. And, you know, it was a great success. Here's the canal. and I should have a better picture somewhere. You can see down here, if you look real close, in 1892 when they're building that canal, how big the canal is and how deep compared to the horses that are in the bottom of the trench. And anyway, it was a huge success, just finished in 1893. Okay, the year it gets finished, St. George, remember, now they have irrigation water because it's called the St. George and Washington Fields, and you can go across the bridge from St. George and get to Washington Fields, and you can grow your lucerne, alfalfa. You can grow your field crops. You can grow cotton, which you're supposed to still be doing as a cash crop. You can grow sorghum, is a better cash crop. So they were happy about that, but they weren't so happy. The pile dam, if you know where Shinab Kaib is, that's this mount here that you can see over Washington. Right at the far end of it, the upstream side of it, was where the pile dam that didn't work was built. And when we went there, I think we went on a field trip there in about 2014, the Historical Society, you could still see a couple of those sticks sticking out of the water from that long ago. So, okay, now this is 1890, okay? This is 1894, third irrigation contract. And here's the little picture I was trying to describe with Deseret and the Promised Land and Canaan, you know, where they make it look the same. It's a promotion of, you know, we're a promised land just like Jerusalem is, but we're just here in this area. And the railroads actually promoted northern Utah in particular for settlement using that image. Anyway, the church at the time, and I got to get the right guy's name, so George Q. Cannon and Wilford Woodruff, who's president of the church in 1890, and we've already said we weren't going to do polygamy anymore. And just that same year, when we were kind of in the good graces of the federal government for the first time in a long time, because we're not going to be polygamous, we scheduled, the Mormons actually scheduled the first, what do they call it, first National Irrigation Congress. And we say, look, we've been irrigating lands in the West and the mining communities and the other, you know, money-making communities in the West, all are dependent on the water and the crops that we deliver them. And we're going to show you how to do that. We're going to show you how we do it. We're going to show you how we work cooperatively. And they have congresses. They start that year, and about every 2 years they have a congress, or every year for a while. And in the end, that movement, the irrigation movement, becomes a big movement supported by a lot of federal people, and it makes a lot of money. This is kind of an aside, but it's something that's unique to us here. This is a 1901 copy of the Juvenile Instructor, which is a Mormon for their youth magazine that was published back then. And they have, you know, instructions as to how to make a water wheel, is what they called it. And the point is that it's the stream of the water pushes downstream on these cups, you know, cans or whatever of water, sometimes open, closed. And then the wheel then turns, but when it pushes, it actually, that can of water or cup of water gets lifted up, and then there's a higher point that it rotates around to, and it dumps that water in a trough that's elevated, you know, half the diameter of the wheel, uphill, and then it can flow out that to a ditch and irrigate some land. So it's a very efficient thing. We had these in Springdale, Rockville, Virgin, on the upper Virgin, because there the problem wasn't, we had water there, more water than land. And so as the populations increased and we needed more land to live on, they started looking, well, I could get this water just a little higher than the real ditch by putting this water wheel in and repairing it. One of them, I got a picture of, is about 30 feet in diameter, lifts the water about 15 feet in Rockville, 1899, called, I can't remember the guy's name anymore, but we stopped doing these, though, for a reason, just after this time period. So these are, say, the first decade of the 1900s. By 1910 and even before that, people were down here planning as early as 1904 to do electric power. And once we had electric power, we had other ways to get water to go uphill. We had pumps, electric pumps that would raise it. And then some of our discipline about, how much land we had and how much we didn't went away. The Hurricane Canal is pretty famous. This was done late. It wasn't started until 1893. 1893 is the year that the Cottonwood Canal gets started in earnest for taking water from Cottonwood, which really would be here. It was going to Silver Reef. The Mormons in Judge Lund's time as mayor had acquired the water rights and surveyed the thing, but they hadn't really built it. They'd set up a company that early, but by about 1893, they start working on it. The water gets in for the Cottonwood Canal in 1898 to St. George, and it's a big deal. We can have the dry lots be wet. People can live on them now. And it's clean water. It's not coming from the Virgin, so it doesn't stink or smell. Still has the problem of the animals walking through it. And of course, it's a long, 18-mile long canal. It's one of the longest ones that was built here. And because it's 18 miles long, you still have even wildlife can go through that canal and make it dirty or dusty. And when it came to St. George, it came with a lot of silt. The Hurricane Canal is about the same time period for construction, but it takes longer until 1904 to irrigate the Hurricane Bench. The one we don't talk about, which is on this map, is Lavercan. And Lavercan Canal was built and finished 1891. And I just got to, because my guys, Woolley, London, Judd, for them, Judd pays laborers. This isn't a normal Mormon subscription. He pays people to build 2-mile, approximately a shorter canal, not the 8 that Hurricane is, 2-mile long canal, but he has to drill a tunnel 800 feet long through the ridge. His problem was when he drilled it through the ridge, the Lavercan Canal, it hit gypsum. And I don't know if anybody knows what happens when water hits gypsum. Gypsum's soluble. It's just white chalk, and the water just makes the chalk melt, and then the water just goes to China. I don't know where it goes. So if you're in the thing, men digging it, just like in the same people that dug the mine tunnels here, dug the canal.
And did they line with rock, or was it just through the dirt?
No, through that tunnel, that's definitely through rock. It's sandstone rock. I mean, it's actually not. It's not this kind of sandstone from over here. It's, if you've been to the Hurricane Cliffs, it's that kind of, I guess they call that limestone. It's a little harder.
But I mean, just out in the middle of the open?
No, it's a tunnel. I mean, it's about...
When they were going through the tunnel.
Mm-hmm. Oh, if they were in dirt, they just dug with the horses. You saw the process for the St. George and Washington Fields Canal. That's the same process. These tunnels, I think the Lavercan Canal is only 5 feet wide at the bottom. It's smaller. The Hurricane Canal is about 7 feet wide at the bottom. Yes?
It wasn't without danger either, because there's a family in Santa Clara, I think it was in Stookies. The father was crippled for life because it caved in on him. So he was down there excavating the canal. And they didn't have, the modern day protections now that they have, and it caved in and crippled him.
Anyway, so they get this canal through the Lavercan. It's one of the earlier ones, 1891, but they can't really use it much for another decade because of this chalk. Here's the water coming out in this lower left-hand corner. That's the workmen who were paid to do it. That's 1891. This is water coming out of the tunnel mouth. And they had, to make it work, they had a guy at each end of the tunnel that worked like a night watchman, but all 24 hours, okay? And they sat there, and if the water stopped running out one end, he ran through the tunnel, which I guess they had a way to do that, to the other end, and then shut the water off, divert it back into the river, okay? So that it wouldn't continue to erode. Then they'd go in and they'd repair the canal. And they had continued outages until Thomas Judd, he's the guy paying for Woolley, London, Judd for this whole enterprise. And their reason to do it is they have this fruit ranch and they can make a lot of money selling fruit. of course, they still have to haul it. They have no railroad, but they did. This is the early Lavercan fruit ranch that was owned by the. It's a different name. That's the name of the corporation, but it's effectively a subsidiary of Woolley London Judd Mercantile. And they had one of these in Almond Ranch down in St. Thomas, so down in the Moapa Valley in Nevada. Woolley London Judd was surprisingly big in New Jersey. The other thing that's interesting here is this lower picture. You can see a little bridge built in 1908. Okay, that's when we thought we were maybe going to go to, remember, Makuntaweep. That's the forerunner of Zion National Park. So this is the bridge, so they don't have to ford the river. Then they can go up the Hurricane Cliff if they're coming in that direction. And this is the 1937 bridge that the Highway Department did. Now there's a pear bridge in front of it. You couldn't see that bridge anymore from this direction. You'd see a Corten one, a rusted steel one, that was built in 2002. So 1937, 2002. So this is a little historic area right in here. And this building is the Pa Tempe Hot Springs, swimming pool building where you went in and got the cure. Thomas Judd is the first guy that claimed the water right for the Pa Tempe Hot Springs. Nobody had claimed it before. Yeah?
Do you know anything about the Chinese that worked on those canals? I found Chinese especially late with the Hurricane Canal. You had Chinese because they were mostly brought here by Silver Reef, the Chinese. But even before then, the interesting thing was a lot of these canals and other work, the hard work that people do down here, going back to the earliest canals and ditches, often the Indians, the Native Americans, were paid by the Mormons and worked on these work projects, and the crews would be about 50% Indians and about 50% Mormons, and the Mormons could pay the Indians. So, if wages for a regular Mormon farmer, young man, 14 years and up, was $3 a day, and they didn't get paid money when they'd say a canal cost $6,000 or something, or $4,000. Well, that was dollars mostly in labor. And then they'd say, little footnote, well, it was only $800 in actual cash money that we had to pay for, blasting caps, harnesses, goods that they had to actually pay for in cash. The rest of it's labor. And it's usually donated by a boy over 14 or a man at the rate of usually $3 a day, okay? But the Indians would work for the Mormons. If they were busy doing their crops and they couldn't spend their day, they'd pay an Indian $1 a day to take their place. And they would actually pay them cash, and the Indians were happy to have it. So a lot of them, it was surprising how the crews worked. And then I'm going to get
What's the date on the Santa Clara?
the Santa Clara.
Canal.
Oh, now Santa Clara Canal, there's a Santa Clara Bench Canal. They take a long time because they have to get a right-of-way across the Indian reservation. It has to be granted by the federal government. And it doesn't happen until Reed Smoot is U.S. Senator. So I want to say he didn't get to be Senator until 1903. So that right-of-way doesn't get granted. I do have a newspaper, and I think it's around 1905, okay? And they're still finishing up in the same newspaper. They're telling the people the Cottonwood Canal got to St. George, was delivering water in 1898, but they're telling people that they have to, in the same article of the Washington County News, they're telling the local people, you have to pay your bills or do your labor for the script that you own, or we're not going to deliver water to your lot, okay? So the number of people subscribed, and they still haven't either done their contract labor or they haven't paid in cash or script. You can still pay St. George City in script in those days, and they haven't done it. So it's fairly, but they got that right away, and then they got to do it in earnest. They delivered water, I think, to the Santa Clara Bench, Ivins area, in 1916, but the town of Ivins didn't even have people until 1923. There weren't any substantial number of homes there, and they didn't become a town until the 30s. That's when they named it after Ivins. And he says, you can use my name, but just make sure you spell it right, because his name was spelled wrong so many times. Anyway, I want to talk a little bit about this dam. We went here in the winter for a field trip in January, and this is the Black Knolls Dam, more often called the Hernia Dam. And it's above St. George, and there's there's the USGS map. Here's the road. You can see the freeway at Washington. You get off. There's a little tunnel. I don't know if you know where the little tunnel is that you can see the end of the old highway? Yeah, the old highway. So it's a tunnel from 1926, we found out. And that's the road you go up to get to. On this USGS map, there's blue as if it held water. If it held water, it was for about 10 minutes. Okay. So apparently, like, I don't know if you know, but some of our new dams, Quail Creek Dam, not Quail Creek, Sand Hollow Dam, okay, which is one of our big, we put water in there, we take it out of the Virgin, we put it in there and we store it. It leaks. The bottom of Sand Hollow Dam leaks, and it puts water into the aquifer underground. And we did that on purpose in that dam because we got smart, and we did that on purpose, so we know that's going to happen and it's not a problem, and we can pump it out. If there was ever a big drought, we can pump that aquifer out and have water, so it makes our water system, it's better than surface evaporation because the water underground doesn't evaporate. That's the current 1990s kind of technology, 2000 technology. In this day, they were trying to hold the water in this Black Knolls Dam, and it was porous. It's lava and other stuff, and it just sunk down to whatever. So it wouldn't stay there for more than a week at a time if they turned it in. And it was odd. Brigham Jarvis complains about this dam a lot in his writings and his memories later. The deal was it's a spring. Cottonwood's a spring, comes out of the base of Pine Valley Mountain, and it's cold, cool water that comes out, and it comes out about the same quantity, winter, summer, spring, fall. It just, it's an amount of water that comes out. So there's in his mind, there was never a reason to store it. There was just what they wanted to do was settle it so that at the end of the long ditch, it would, clarify, and then they could take the more pure water, let the silt be down the bottom. That was their idea. But it didn't work, and so they called it the Hernia Dam, and they spent, so the canal was, I want to say, $8,000 to build in those days in money to get it done for 1898. For the next 20 years probably, they worked on this dam trying to make it hold water. They spent upwards of $40,000, 5 times more than they had on the canal. And again, it's not money, it's labor. So that's why they call it the Hernia Dam. You got a hernia, but you got no water. That's what you got. And the remnant's still there. It's an interesting thing people have told us. George has had people write in and say, you said there was never a railroad here. We found a railroad, a thing that looks just like a railroad structure up there, and they point to that dam and they say, see, that was a railroad, grade leveling. It actually was a dam that never held water. So, and all built out of big chunks of lava or basalt. This is Brigham Jarvis. He's the guy that was the surveyor for the Cottonwood Canal. And I have some pictures, but it was a difficult route. The Indians came and told the Mormons when they saw what they were doing that it wouldn't work. It ran uphill. And when you look, if you just look at, there's enough of an optical illusion in this one portion, you swear that water goes uphill. But Brigham Jarvis, using a very crude, what they used to call a spirit level. So a spirit level isn't an instrument like an engineer would use now with a little bubble and a lot of accuracy. It's just it's still got just the bubble, but you're just literally looking through a tube back, and you're trying to say, is that line horizontal? And you set the thing so it's supposed to always be horizontal, and he just looks horizontally out there, and then he says, okay, it's horizontal plus one, if I'm going downhill, minus a little tiny bit. And they made that canal, it's a very flat percentage for quite a bit of it. It doesn't want to come downhill at more than 2%, because when it comes down the greater slope, then about 2% would be 2 feet and 100, And it's probably, they've run that closer to 1.5% in 100 feet, and sometimes less, because when the water goes downhill faster, it erodes the channel, and they didn't have concrete, so they don't want to erode the channel. And part of their problem was these canals that were long would have debris clog them and stuff, and so you typically had, for any of the canals, Hurricane, Lavercan. Of course, Lavercan, it was more of a man size. You could walk and run the length of the thing. Hurricane, they'd have a ditch rider. So it's a guy that his job, he was actually appointed, got a full-time job. He's the ditch rider. There's maybe 2 or 3 of those guys for each canal. They took turns riding the ditch and finding the debris and making they rode, repaired as they just went along every day. Some of them had to be 24 hours a day. The Hurricane Canal, especially at the beginning, they had to even patrol it at night because the water and the erosive qualities don't stop because the sun goes down. So they took lanterns, and looked to see if that was having problems. But Brigham Jarvis was quite the guy. He, in addition to surveying the Cottonwood Canal, he's the one who thought up the spillway for the Washington Fields Dam. So now let's see if we can get. The water. One of the things when they turned that Cottonwood water into St. George, they also dried up the water that went to the water wheel at the cotton mill in Washington. And they didn't restore that for, so again, it ties into Woolly London Judd. Tom Judd, it says leases, it's really the company, the United Order Company. They lease the cotton mill, and they do woolen goods and cotton. So they do cotton, not exclusively cotton, but they'll do woolen goods and mill those as well. And they make a profit until the water is taken by St. George that runs the mill. So for a decade, and of course, if he's making a profit, you ask, why does he go out of business, or it's a lease, why is the lease terminated? Because the water's gone. It took me a long time to find that out. And they could have restored it because they had surplus water, but they didn't. Here's just a notice, and this is kind of cute, so I'm going to read it. So this is 1898, and this is the city recorder. It just says, you got to pay up, or we're not going to deliver you water. Now, Tom Judd, later, 1912, so quite a bit later, he becomes the mayor of St. George. He sends out the same notice in 1912. If you don't pay your water bills, there's no free water in St. George. We won't give it to you. So.
Do you want to just check on your time?
Yeah.
A quarter after now.
Oh, I'm done. So you're telling me I'm done.
Well, I just want you to check and see if you're done.
Yeah, the other thing, I'll just go a couple others. So the firm Woolly London Judd also become major subscribers in this Enterprise Canal, which is one of the last ones. And it starts as early as 1898 getting organized. The water doesn't get there till after, I think, 1912. This is the people from the town standing on it. But because water was such an essential thing, and because they had a mercantile business, and in their mercantile business, they branched out. They operated the mines here for a decade or so. After the other miners were gone, they operated a copper smelter in St. George that needed water. In fact, when the Cottonwood water came in 1898, they had a sale pending to a guy named John Webb, who was going to buy their copper mine and smelter. And Webb came and said, look, we're a big mining company, we're well capitalized. Why don't we pipe the water from Cottonwood Spring all the way to St. George? We'll pay for that. In exchange, let us have the water from West Springs, that's by where the smelter was that Woolly London Judd owned. And the city council said, what do you think they said? Okay. They said, no, it's water. We never give up water rights or water ever because we need the water. So then he moved the operation out to Shem, which is west of the Indian Reservation, and they built a town out there that flourished for a decade, and smelted and mined copper. But and Woolly London Judd made a big profit when they sold that mine. But they had other needs for water. Here, one of the last things I found out was in 1893, so they started their mining operations here on this chloride or custom, we'll run the mill when the stack's big enough of the ore that the Mormon farmers collect in 1884, 85. In 1893, they decide, well, in order to make this mill run, the Christie or the Snormont, we have to fire it with firewood, and the firewood's getting exhausted, so we're going to divert some water from Leeds Creek, and we're going to make it a water-powered mill. They do, and the efficiency goes up, and they stay in business until after statehood, maybe as late as 1900 here. But, not all the time, but they're making a living here. Anyway, that's long enough, and you got questions?
Cottonwood Spring?
I do not have a picture of Cottonwood Springs. And if I now that the water district owns it, you wouldn't see the spring. If you go to even the West Spring, it's all closed up, so it can't be contaminated at the mouth of the spring. It's actually got walls in front of it nowadays, and so I think the same thing's true at the Cottonwood Spring. You wouldn't see anything. There's pipes that pipe it.
When did they pipe Cottonwood Creek?
Okay, it wasn't finished until the 1930s because the CCC boys helped finish it. And the CCC camp was the St. George camp that did that work.
I'm sure you think I do, but it's been a very informative morning. If you have personal questions, why don't you see Dick when we're all finished? Let's give him a round.
Yeah, all right. Thank you.